Hello, friends, and welcome to the podcast. Today we have the honor of having Alex Maceda join us in the studio. Alex is a visual artist and writer based in Joshua Tree. I first became aware of her work a few years ago on Instagram. We became online friends, and this is the first time we got to meet in person. So it's an absolutely wide-ranging, philosophical, beautiful, fun talk that we have. We cover all kinds of topics, as you'll see. I'm sure you'll get just a ton out of this because, as you'll be able to soon tell, so much thought, heart, life, curiosity goes into Alex's work, and she's able to communicate that in such a poignant and heartfelt way. So before we jump into the podcast in just a second, a little housekeeping. I have a new art collection dropping real soon, a new body of work I've been working so hard on in the studio. I'm absolutely in love with it, and I think you may be too. So if you want to stay involved with that and also any more podcasts coming out, I got a ton lined up throughout the rest of the year, and any other projects, the best place to do that is my newsletter, which you can find on my website, striderpatton.com. Also, always updated on the daily is the Instagram, striderpatton. So we'll get in there with Alex Maceda right now. All right, friends, very excited. Today's guest, Alex Maceda, is joining me in the studio. I am very, very excited for this conversation because we have been internet friends for a couple years now, maybe.
Yeah.
And this is our first time meeting in real life.
Which is so great.
It's wonderful. I told you earlier, I've had a couple of these encounters the last few months, meeting internet friends in real life. And like we were just saying before we started rolling, it really seals the deal for, human to human contact.
Yeah.
But Alex, thank you for being here.
Thank you so
Would
much
you
for
like
having
to
me.
share with us who you are and what you make?
Great. Super excited to be here. Yeah, like what we were saying, we've been following each other for 3 years.
I think it was like the Frida Art Show.
The Frida Art Show.
You were a guest and I was a guest. That was when I first encountered you.
So I did that show in October 2020, which was like 6 months into my professional art career, I guess you could say. So maybe we'll start there. I am an artist and writer. I live in Joshua Tree, California, and I'm originally from the Bay Area, so home for the holidays. How I primarily make abstract work. I started working bigger and bigger, but pieces about this big. I started as an oil painter. I'm mostly working in acrylic on unprimed canvas now. And my writing is poetry and essays, mostly nonfiction, mostly memoir style kind of personal essays. How did I get, as I mentioned, so we connected originally through Frida Art Show in 2020, and that was early into my professional artistic career, I guess you would say. I've been an artist my whole life, but I had a 10-year career in business. So I studied classics and fine arts in undergrad. I thought I wanted to go into fashion. I kind of always dreamed, like many little kids, I always dreamed of being an artist, but for better or for worse, there were no professional artists in my family. Not that my parents were opposed to it, but I was smart enough to quote unquote go to real school. So I went to real school. There were like no examples really in my life of people who went to art school. So I minored in art. I thought I wanted to go into fashion as kind of like a creative-ish industry. The short version of the story is I hated my fashion internships. I ended up thinking the more interesting stuff in the fashion world was going on the business side. So like many grads, I went into management consulting for a few years. And that was around the time the first wave of internet startups came out. So I got a job at Everlane really early on in my career, like 2014, before anyone knew what Everlane was. And that kind of started my marketing journey. So after that, I've spent probably 5 or 6 years doing marketing for startups. I even went to business school thinking I was going to start my own fashion company. And basically in my corporate career, I guess you would say, every job I took was more and more creative, and it never felt quite creative enough. And that itch to just be like, even when I went to business school, I was like, oh, maybe I'll take 3 months off before and try to be an artist. Or I took kind of the summer in business school. I got a part-time job so that I could explore what a more creative career could look like. And by my last role, I was even doing interior design. Like I was designing therapy clinics for a mental health company in San Francisco called Two Chairs. And even that was like not creative enough. So I just had that itch. And I quit my job February 2020, thinking I was going to travel the world for 3 months and figure out what I was going to do. Had no idea we were about to go into a multi-year global pandemic. And then the rest is kind of history. I got trapped in San Francisco. I started painting every day. I started an Instagram for my art, sold a painting and then another painting, got invited to do Frida. And by the end of 2020, I was making as much money selling art as I was freelancing. And that was almost exactly 2 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. This was such a journey.
Yes.
Yeah. There's an interesting point when one is considering leaving other work to pursue their creative career. And that aligned with the pandemic, you said. And I just wonder if you could maybe go into a bit more about what that decision-making process was like for you. You said, you're kind of inching your way up to, a balancing point where you're like, I could be making more money doing my art, and then I have some freedom there. But also you're kind of all dependent on yourself at that point. What kind of like questions were you asking yourself in that process?
Yeah. I would say I'm still in the journey. I still freelance a bit, and I've kind of gone back and forth. I feel like everyone told me the goal was to be a full-time artist, and a lot of my experience being an artist in the past 2.5 years has been defining for myself what that means. And I think most people think of a full-time artist as like you make all your money from art. And I found that it's been hard for me to navigate that, honestly.
Yeah.
Because, number one, it's just hard to be an art. It's hard to make money from art, period. And I found myself, when I was putting the pressure to make all of my money on art, what I started to make changed. And that has been like an interesting journey. I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Yeah.
But in addition to, as I mentioned, I'm sharing my art on Instagram. There's that weird feedback loop of seeing what people like immediately. And then if you're making all of your money from it, all of a sudden I started to shift to make art that I thought would sell well versus making art that I thought was the art that I wanted to make. So that kind of is a roundabout way of saying I've been navigating that still. But going back to 2020, as I mentioned, I quit my corporate job, and I actually didn't intend to pursue art when I quit. I intended to do something more creative, and I didn't know what that was going to look like. Because honestly, when I quit, I didn't believe I could be an artist. And even I remember when I did that Frida show, which for everyone who doesn't know is kind of like an online art show, I almost thought of that as like my coming out party as an artist, to maybe put a little bit more color into like where I was in February 2020. It was like I always dreamed about becoming an artist. I didn't actually think that was a reality, and I wasn't even confident enough to call myself an artist with like a capital A. I'm like, oh yeah, I've been painting, or I minored in art, I do art, but I had a really hard time like owning that idea of being an artist. And I think part of it, I was a bit shy of sharing my work. I didn't know if I could sell my work. I didn't know if I had to sell my work to feel like a quote unquote real artist. So there are all of these kind of things swirling around. But to get back to your original question, some of the things I was thinking about, I guess I was still freelancing. So I quit my job and I took a freelance gig. I had saved a bit of money, so I knew that I didn't have to make too much money for at least a few months while I figured out kind of my next move. And I really didn't know what my next move was other than knowing I wanted it to be even more creative. I think my kind of thesis was I was going to start some sort of like creative brand or something, but the pandemic just threw everything into a loop. So I was really, some of the things going back and forth through my head was like, I had some practical things of, I had a number in mind of how much, the minimum I had to make a month to like pay my rent and pay for all my food, basically like not lose money.
Yeah.
And then I had an idea of where I wanted to get financially, like a little bit higher than that minimum by the end of the year. So there was kind of this like very math equation where I was like, that basically means if I'm making this much on freelancing, I have to make this much on art. And then that number has kind of like moved back and forth. It's really been a journey.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You touched on several topics in there I'd like to jump in on. But I think I myself have gone back and forth between picking up part-time work and being fully art, including right now I'm doing some part-time work with my buddy's fabrication shop. But that's where a place where I get to use my hands. I get to learn and practice some machines and tools that I then get to integrate into my art. And it's gone back and forth. And like you said, I feel like there's kind of like a pressure in society for artists like to become a full-time artist and then that's it. Mm-hmm. And I certainly felt that. And when I did, quit working part-time at restaurants like during school and everything, and I did nothing but art, like truly full-time for like 5 years. And I mean, yeah, it's really hard. And then like I went back and got a part-time job for a while somewhere else. And then I noticed when you have some consistent money coming in from elsewhere, there isn't as much pressure on the making of the art, and what I made changed.
Yeah.
Because I didn't feel that pressure. Mm-hmm. And I recently just heard the author Austin Kleon talk about this. And he wrote that famous book, Steal Like an Artist, and several others. And I was listening to him in conversation, and someone asked him kind of like this, like, oh, going like full-time writer or whatever. Mm-hmm. And he just kind of said, he's like, this is just like a freak thing for me because all of my heroes had full-time jobs. My heroes were poets, and they were all working in other industries and disciplines or whatever. And like poetry was a passion for them. And so I've been thinking a bit, because I just listened to that like last week, but it's a question that I always hear from people. And, being like I recently had a gallery show opening, and it was my first one in years. And it was wonderful. Thank you. And I had, someone come up to me that we've been just kind of talking online, and they're like really trying to break into the art world. And I've just shared any advice and help I can with them over the last year. And, she asked like, well, I just want to get to be a full-time artist. And I now understand kind of at a point in my career hindsight that it comes with a lot of weight, and that weight can direct what you make. Yeah. And like you said, second part to your great run there was being an independent artist, meaning not solely making work for galleries to represent you, but you representing yourself online and sharing everything on Instagram. Like you said, you get feedback in real time, and how that too can kind of direct what you make intentionally or unintentionally. Yeah. It's a tricky thing to navigate, but for anyone listening out there, don't rush into being a full-time artist, because you don't have to be.
Yeah, totally. And I think, like very practically speaking, I realized, because I did go full-time, I guess probably for 4 months, like no other freelance roles, and was fully focused on art. And I kind of got lost in the sauce a bit. Like really? I decided to bring freelancing back, and I now freelance probably like 10 hours a week. I normally have like one marketing client. Number one, it really benefits me personally to have some Zoom meetings that I'm accountable to show up to. it's really nice to have coworkers in a way because I freelance for startups, and just that little bit of money makes me know that I'm never going to go too far into the red. And I think how I've started to think about it, I'll sometimes take a job here or there. I used to think about almost like art. Like, I realize every time I've been stressed about my art career, like my aperture is too small. Like, I'm like, oh, I'm freelancing too much. But when I zoom out to a month instead of just a week, or even 3 months instead of just a month, I'm like, oh, it's actually quite balanced. So, for example, I had 3 freelance roles in October, just because I had a couple good things come my way. So there was not that much art making in that month, but those gave me a lot of wiggle room for November and December. So I've been painting, like, if you've probably seen online, I painted kind of a whole collection of paintings unexpectedly before the holidays, just because I had that spaciousness.
Yeah.
And I realized too, I don't know where I read this, but I've definitely heard, especially authors, talk about this. I've started to think about my painting process. I used to think about it just as like the time my brush was on the canvas. But for me, at least, it's so much bigger. And to be able to freelance, I've almost thought of it like I get to turn off my painting brain. I kind of put it on autopilot when I'm doing marketing freelancing. And I get a lot of, it's almost like that subconscious processing that's happening. And it gives me a break, so when I come back to painting, all of a sudden there's so much more there. Versus when I was like just focusing on it. I'm sure some people are maybe like mentally strong enough, I don't know if that's the right word, to do it full time. But for me, like the shifting and like different focuses actually helps me, I think, almost like reset the painting part of my brain.
Yeah, I feel that. And also, when I do hit the studio, I have less time. And so I have kind of sharpened my focus and what I want to accomplish and things, so that when it is time to create, like you said, I've kind of maybe in the subconscious, things have been like stewing around a bit. And then I'm really eager to get into the studio.
Yeah.
Whereas before I lived in there and I just like would find myself like tidying up too much and procrastinating or just like doing
I'm
weird
gonna
stuff.
reorganize the paints
Yeah,
again.
feel like I gotta walk the dog again, and now it's there's like finite time, and so when it is time, it's much more focused in a really fun, productive way.
Yeah.
And that's led to a lot of kind of breakthroughs. Like I heard someone talk about the subconscious, and this is like some like MIT researcher or something. Like, this is not related to art, but well, I guess maybe it is because he writes books. But he was saying, he's like, oh, before I go to sleep, I will ask a question, and then I will wake up and it will be answered. And he's like, this is a very real thing.
Yeah.
And I do it every night. And he's like, the subconscious mind, when you put intention into it, stuff happens there. And so, and you hear about people like, putting earphones in and like, putting on like stuff they're supposed to study or whatever, like exams or whatever, to, affirmations or whatever. But
Totally. Yeah, I read that book. I think it's Matthew Walker, Why We Sleep. Have you read that one?
No, I've heard of it. Haven't read it.
So there's a whole section on this, and there's an example of, he uses an example of multiple musicians who kind of wrote their best songs like half asleep, right? So authors who leave a notepad by the side of their table, or I can't remember who it was. Some famous like rock star basically wrote one of his most popular songs like half asleep, because he had his guitar next to his bed and a recorder. He like recorded it kind of in what I call like the medial state, which like we can go into. And he woke up and replayed it, and it's like him singing, but because you kind of turn off that thinking mind, there's all of this stuff milling around.
Yeah.
And I'm fascinated by that kind of stuff.
Yeah, same here. The plight of humans that we have turned into such thinkers, whereas we used to be, maybe, or some of us still are, but just a little bit more of beers.
Yeah.
And it's something I feel like us in the modern world are really working with, because we live in a world supposed to be doing stuff.
Yeah.
And so doing and thinking, we just get so trapped up here that when you're able to kind of let go of that, whether it's sleep or meditation or like altered states of some kind, that you're tapping into this different level of information.
Yeah.
And that's a place that, artists of, or anybody in a creative practice that's been doing it long enough, eventually they kind of get into that place, and that's what keeps them coming back. And
Yeah.
because it's not so much thinking, it's more just action and doing without thinking, flow state,
Yeah.
what some social researchers might call it. But
Totally.
but that is the magic spot where things seem to come and we bring them out.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the more I dive into my practice, the more I'm like, my number one goal is just to get out of the way.
Yeah.
Like, my mind to get out of the way. And I think it's been really interesting because I only started painting abstract in the past 2 or 3 years. Like, all of my art prior to that was normally figures,
Yeah.
a lot of self-portraits, a lot of kind of like hyper-realism. I was working with like pen, pencil, charcoal, and then I moved into this like colored abstract work, which in a lot of ways has forced me not to think, because I'm not depicting I'm depicting something I see, but I'm not depicting like, a still life on the table.
Yeah.
So that's definitely what keeps me coming back. Like, my painting practice has become more of a meditation than anything.
Yeah.
And it's like I can drop into a much calmer state than I am normally walking through waking life.
Yeah. Yeah, I was talking with a guy who is into martial arts, and I too have been into some martial arts, and I was sharing what I've witnessed as my comparisons between the two, and I very much see the art form of it now, because it entails creative thinking and everything, and I was like, oh yeah, it's just like when I'm on the mat, I'm not thinking so much. And he's like, oh yeah, Strider, because thinking takes too long.
Yeah.
And when he said that, it just like something clicked in me, and I immediately brought it to the comparison of being in the studio and making art, because thinking takes too long.
Yeah.
Because thinking for me is very linear timeline. We're using words in progression, whereas seeing something, just instantly there's a feeling. Whereas describing a feeling can take a while. And, picture's worth 1,000 words.
Yeah.
That feeling when a beautiful song hits you, whatever the experience is, a sunset, whatever, it's this instant level of beauty that doesn't require thinking. And so to be in a practice where you're making stuff, it's this, I don't know, really magical little, what do you call it, medial state?
Medial state, yeah.
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 And so what is your process in terms of your creation of visual art? Because I want to get into the writing too. But for your painting, how does it come about?
Yeah. So I guess you would call me like a process-driven painter, in that a lot of my art depends actually on how I'm putting the paint down. So for everyone who hasn't seen it, primarily in the past year, I've been working on unprimed canvas and using basically like acrylic washes. So I use traditional acrylic paint, I water it down, and a lot of my process has become how I layer it and how I place it. There's throwing, there's pouring, there's traditional brushwork. When you watch me paint, if you haven't seen my Instagram, I'm almost never sitting at kind of like your traditional canvas on an easel. And now it's been getting bigger and bigger, and I'm cutting up canvases and this whole thing. But from a concept point of view, I used to, when I first started kind of doing abstract work, it was very emotion inspired. So I would be thinking about like the feeling of, as simple and complex as love to like, kind of internal turmoil, and what color is that, and what would the strokes look like. But more and more, as I kind of teased, I'm really interested in like what I call medial states. Some people call them like liminal spaces. Particularly, that time in between fully being awake and fully being asleep, or, when you're dreaming, or when you're kind of awake, but you're kind of processing, or even just daydreaming. My most recent set of painting is like when you close your eyes and you see different colors. I don't know if everyone sees different colors, but I often see different colors, and it's like soft and that kind of thing. So I've been trying more and more to literally capture what that looks like. So in a lot of ways, I am trying to capture dreams. I often paint in my dreams.
Wow, really?
I will paint a full composition in a dream and try to remember it when I wake up.
Wow. Like lucid dreaming? Like, do you know you're dreaming and painting, or just you remember the next day?
Kind of both. I do
Cool.
quite a bit of lucid dreaming, but often when I'm painting, it's hard to explain. It's like I kind of know, but I'm not full. The thinking isn't happening.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I'm aware it's not a normal state, but I'm not like, okay, now I'm going to put blue. I feel like I'm watching myself do it.
Interesting. Yeah.
So there's some of that. And then there's some where I'll literally meditate in front of the canvas. So I am more and more treating my painting almost like a ritual. I really am interested in this idea of like, what if art was your church? What if painting was church? How would you treat it? What would that look like? How would you treat the space? How would you treat the canvas? How would you treat your brushes? What does it look like to pray, the equivalent of pray in front of art?
Yeah.
So I will often sit and kind of traditionally meditate right before I start a new composition, and I'll often see a color or something. And sometimes it's a color where I'm like, really? Are we going to do a big splash of orange? I don't really like that color, but I try my best to go with whatever I see, and that's kind of how I start the process.
I love that. I've talked about this with a few friends where making art is a form of prayer. It is communion with the divine.
Yes.
And if we are the universe experiencing itself as a human, and the universe is expanding, and we are the bridge between ideas and reality. We are human, we create, we take concepts and we bring them into this world in the infinite ways that we do. We are a part of the process of the universe expanding.
Yeah.
And the universe being everything all at once. And when you treat it like you said, like that, what if this is a divine act and we treat it with the respect and the beauty that it deserves? What kind of world would we live in then? It made me think. I recently heard about, I can't do the Japanese name, but traditional form of Japanese theater where the players at the beginning will lay down and put towels on their backs and in line go across and wipe the stage floor. And in doing so, they're limbering up and they're stretching, but it's a ritualistic act of setting the stage together in unison, respecting, treating the stage as a holy place. And I was like,
love that.
Man, it's so good. So good. I meditate almost every day, and I've definitely done some projects where it's like I'm intentionally going to meditate, and then whatever comes out on the other side of that, that's the practice that day. And it's like you said, you kind of run into points where you want to control it, like, why are you showing me this color or whatever, but maybe just trusting in the information and seeing where you take it.
Yeah.
It's as I get older and the more I fall in love with this, it's becoming more magical.
Yeah.
It's becoming more beautiful.
I'm totally with you on that. Like I said, I really feel like I'm just trying to get out of the way. And some of my best paintings, both the ones I like the most and that have been kind of the most well received, I look at those and I was in total flow state. My favorite drawing professor in college, I remember on the first day, said, sometimes he was like looking up at the wall, and he was this really eccentric drawing professor. And he goes, sometimes you're just making something, and you're making something, and you're making something, and you lose yourself in it. And you step back, and you're like, whoa, I made that. And it ups the ante for the rest of your life. And I've always remembered that.
Yeah.
And like my best pieces, that's like how I feel. I'm just like, oh my God, did I make that? Like, where did that come from? And all of a sudden, think of those pieces as almost like jumping off points into the next body of work or phase or whatever you might want to call it.
Totally.
But I think when you lose yourself in art, it does start to up the ante for the rest of your life. It creates like this new possibility of something that you didn't think you could do, but you did.
Mm-hmm.
So then it's like, okay, now that I know I can do that, like, what do I do next?
Totally.
And for me, so much of my work is dependent on colors. And more, I mean, the feedback I get is often that my colors are not what people would have assumed to put together.
There are definitely points where something is made and it's a pivotal moment. And maybe it's a totally new line, a direction of work, or a happy accident that maybe you just looked at something differently and some paint splattered or something dropped, or the way you peeled tape back and saw this thing, and all of a sudden things are different. It's, again, I think it's kind of like a collaborative dance with the divine. It is saying yes and.
Yes.
Thank you. And if we're trying to control too much, then we're going to miss those opportunities. And from speaking with several artist friends and hearing plenty of others say it was a surprise, it was a discovery that, made some big point that they're now known for. What have you noticed in your process of painting, and any points like that in yourself that were like ahas or complete surprises?
Yeah. I can think of two. And one kind of defined this whole acrylic unprimed phase that I'm on, which was I had to do a really big painting for a project, and I had linen, so I had used linen, and the linen, I'd never painted on linen before, and it's not a very tight weave, which just meant a lot of the paint, because it was watered down, seeped through. And so when I lifted the canvas, there was all these paint splatters on the floor. And I was like, oh, I kind of like that better than the linen one I painted. And so I put a piece of canvas on top of it and let it soak through. And when I lifted it up, it had this like really beautiful mixed, blended splatter look. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, what if I start with not a blank canvas? Like, you're always taught to start with a blank canvas, but I'm like, why do we start with a blank canvas? That's not really how life goes. There's all of these, like you said, happy accidents. And I was using canvas basically as like drop cloths on the floor, and realizing that my brush marks when I was wiping my brushes or just the spills looked really nice. And so I started stretching those drop cloths as the next canvas and using that to respond to for my compositions.
Yeah.
And that has been like a big part of my practice now. There's so many layers, and some people are like, how did you think of this piece or that piece? And the truth is like, oh, I didn't. It happened to be on the floor, and I used that as a starting point for the next piece.
Yeah.
And that was not planned.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because I really entered my professional art career from doing street art and murals, and there you're always working off of what's already present. It's, for the longest time, I felt much more comfortable approaching a 30-foot wall than standing in front of a perfect white rectangle in my studio, because then it's just like, give me something to work off of. And street artists are always interacting with what's already present. And muralists are always using unique architectural features, windows, doors, pipes, like all kinds of stuff that's already there that you're interacting with. And that's really fascinating to hear. Fun point for you was starting from an unexpected, result from a previous work.
Exactly. And then the second one has been, we were talking about painting as ritual. So I'll often light incense, like Palo Santo or like, any kind of sacred plant. And I remember once I lit my Palo Santo and I was looking at it, and it's like a, piece of wood for anyone who doesn't know. And I'm just like, oh, this is just charcoal. Like charcoal is just burnt wood. And so I made a mark on the canvas, and Palo Santo is actually this really like rich black comes out. So I have started integrating that into my practice too. I was telling you before we started recording, I once accidentally kind of spilt a dish of burnt sage, and all of the ash from the sage mixed with whatever wet color was on the canvas and made this really beautiful other color. So as I've started to think more and more as like painting as ritual, it's like, oh, what if these ritualistic elements like sacred plants or Palo Santo or whatever it might be actually become part of the composition itself?
Yeah.
That's kind of the accident I'm sitting in now. I think living in Joshua Tree, like the thing that's always on my mind is how I'm so inspired by the place that I live. Like, how does the land, for lack of a better word, come into my painting practice more? So there's plenty of artists that use like earth pigments. There's so many different good colors of sand and a little bit of clay in Joshua Tree. So that feels like a natural path for me to go on.
Yeah.
But that's something that I'm currently thinking about a lot, especially as I've started to bring kind of like the plant charcoal in, is like, oh, if I'm someone who's living in this place, how do I honor this place a little bit more in my practice?
Totally. I'm happy you brought that up. I was going to ask about maybe a difference that you've noticed between making art while living in San Francisco versus full Joshua Tree, because I'm curious about that, how our environment affects us and, our entire lives, and definitely as artists as to the kind of work that we make. Because recently you went to do a residency in Iceland.
I did, yes.
And so what was that experience like? And did you also notice how that, being in a completely different environment, a totally different environment, what kind of work did you make, and how was that environment informing your work?
Okay, so to start, everyone's like, oh, you have so much more space in Joshua Tree. And that's like objectively true. I never had a dedicated studio until I moved to Joshua Tree. I bought a little house there, and now I have like my own painting studio in my home, which is amazing. But I think there's kind of two big ways it's impacted me. So first, it's mental, I guess you would say. We didn't use this word, but one of the things I think about a lot is like spaciousness, literally, spiritually, figuratively. I'm just way less stressed in Joshua Tree than I was in San Francisco.
Yeah.
And that's partially because of job. I think that's partially because of place. I get really inspired by seeing that much horizon. So I just feel a lot more space kind of mentally and spiritually, which helps my painting practice a lot. Because it's almost like I don't have to turn as many knobs off to get into that like light flow state.
Yeah.
So that has been impacted me a lot. But then like environment, and this kind of gets to Iceland. So in Joshua Tree, as much as I can, I paint outside. And the effect that has had is I started as an oil painter. When I was living in San Francisco, it would take 5 or 6 days for a layer of oil paint to dry. I got to Joshua Tree, was painting outside in the sun, and my paint would dry in a day, if not in half a day.
Wow.
Which meant that from morning to evening, I could literally see the texture of the oil paint change, and I could do all of these other layered effects I was trying to do in San Francisco, but I just couldn't because it was taking too long to dry. So it literally affected my painting style, and that has stayed true with acrylics. It's like one of the reasons I started doing all these layers is I was painting outside, and the paint was drying so fast that I could do all the layers. when I went to Iceland, so I went to Iceland at the end of the summer for a residency, and it was cold, and we were on the water, so it was quite moist. So, and I brought raw canvas and acrylic and was going to kind of paint the same way I did in Joshua Tree, and I just found, because it was so much colder, my paint wasn't drying, which meant I was doing this work that was a lot more dense, maybe you could call it. Like the pigments were kind of sitting for a longer time. They were bleeding more into each other. I felt more called. It didn't really make sense to do washes. I had to do more brush work. So I had all the same tools, but because I couldn't work with the temperature and the dryness in the same way, kind of like the whole style changed.
Yeah. It's something I feel like people who don't paint or make art don't understand, is that it's very elemental. And wherever you're at, and I mean, even like a photographer friend of mine was saying, there's just like the quality of light where you are. You know, you take photos in London, it's going to look a lot different than LA. And everything it just makes you feel like really a part of, I mean, the natural world. Even if you are painting inside, still there can be a difference.
It's very humbling.
Yeah. And some things, that just takes some time. Like, I've never worked in oils, but plenty of friends, and the drying time is a real thing to think about, and humbling, practice your patience.
And I think that's the part where you get in touch with kind of like the craftsman part of being an artist, of like, oh, there's so much of my work that is just me knowing exactly how the paint is going to interact with this amount of water and this amount of heat outside. And it really is like elemental. There's so much physics to it too, because I'm doing a lot of watering down of paints, thickening paints, like using different types of paints. So much of it is just holding in my head, like, how is this going to sit on this if this is like just this dry versus like this wet? It's so, I like to be like, oh, I'm a scientist. I'm a scientist as much as I'm an artist.
Time to hit the lab, do some experiments. We've kind of circled around it a little bit, and I just want to ask it very point blank. What are ideas, and where do they come from?
I mean, I think I'm going to be on a quest to know the answer to this for my entire life. But I more and more think, I mean, we kind of talked about, art as the artist, as sometimes I think of us as like interpreters for the divine. There's like this, I guess you could almost call it like a world of ideas, like world of inspiration, dimension of inspiration. I'm not exactly sure what you want to call it. I think it's been called in a lot of different things at a lot of different points in time. But how I experience it is like, I do experience ideas and inspiration as kind of like sitting around us, and I feel like when I'm creating art, all of a sudden there's a channel where I can grab something, or that something is coming to me. I more and more think we don't come up with any ideas. It's kind of like, when I think about like people patenting ideas, I'm like, it's kind of a ridiculous thought, right?
Yes.
I don't know if that's gonna like come back to haunt me one day, but I see it so much. Artists shouldn't, well, you mentioned like steal like an artist, but all of these examples of artists being like, oh, this artist from across the world stole my idea and like needs to be canceled. I'm constantly thinking like, there are billions of people on this earth. Do I really think what I came up with has never been thunk by anyone else? So I think like, I like to think of ideas as divine inspiration, that they're kind of all around us. I think it was maybe Cheryl Strayed. Someone had this fantastic TED Talk on creativity where they talk about the idea rushing past you. And if you don't grab it, it goes to the next artist or writer, or, creative, whatever it might be. And I really love that. And that has kind of been my experience. Like I said, I meditate or I dream or I have some sort of altered state where I see something and I'm like, oh, that one is up for grabs. Am I going to take it and interpret it however I can at this moment? But I don't think that's like just me or just, I don't think I am the only one who's able to access that. And I more and more think of artists, like our kind of quest as artists is to be the best interpreter and the best channel to that dimension, area of consciousness, divine existence, fill in the blank of whatever most resonates to you. But the deeper and deeper I dive into this path, the more and more I'm like, oh, I'm just trying to touch that and interpret that the best I can. And that is like both a privilege and a gift, and I think a responsibility, if you are able to do that, to bring that to other people.
Yeah. Was that by chance Elizabeth Gilbert's
Yes.
TED Talk?
Yes.
Have you read her book, Big
Magic? Yes.
Oh,
so good.
so good. So many great stories of different artists and creatives in all kinds of different fields talking about that beautiful something that's outside of them and that communication with an artist to realize the work.
Yeah.
And she said something in there about, like, I don't know if it was ancient Greece or Rome, but back then they said it's the idea, the inspiration is elsewhere, like the muse or the daemon.
Yeah.
And that it's the duty of the artist to, be there and take it. But any claim and praise was not to the artist. It's like almost like the artist was just in service of the divine. Whereas today, we love to celebrate ourselves and pat ourselves on the back and look at this, look at how great I am. And, social media and all of it and all the fame and, quickly we can slip into the 7 sins and more. But she also said something about that where she's like, well, we're doing a disservice to our artists today because there is that pressure too, aside from like the celebration of something great, but also the struggle and the suffering that can come from not meeting a societal idea of what an artist should be and all the pressures on the artist to come up with something, whereas in ancient Rome it wouldn't be on the artist. It's like I'm just here waiting I'm just the hand. I'm here waiting for the divine.
And I was a classics major, so I studied ancient Greece in particular, and that's exactly right? There's the concept of muses that bless you with divine inspiration. There's the concept of the daimon, which is like a spirit kind of that helps you in your studio. So there's so many points, and it happens in all across the world at every point in history. There's so many examples of divine inspiration being apart from the human and like given to the human. And I think it's really interesting in modern society where we've become so secular and so kind of like, especially in Western society, so individualistic, where it's like, oh, we wanted to just be us. And there's good parts of that too. But I love history, and I'm really interested in religion, both as like a power that has inspired the worst things in people and the best things. I think it's like fascinating that can be a thing. And I think a lot about that, especially like in terms of what's happening today and how I think, some people, because Western society has become so secular in some ways, it's like controversial to be like, oh, even divine in anything, people get really like touchy about that.
Oh, yeah.
And I think about that a lot because I don't identify as a religious person. I identify as a spiritual person, and I'm really interested in religion and studying all different sorts of religion as kind of like a lens into spirituality in different parts of the world. But it is interesting to think that, like, some of these ideas that we've talked about today for a long time were just, like, widely accepted ideas.
Yeah.
That are kind of just, like, it feels like popping up on the fringes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. I would not have said that sentence or asked that question probably 6-8 years ago myself. Growing up in definitely like a spiritual house from my mom, but then my dad, just like fervent atheist, like loves like time, space, the cosmos and stuff, but like we're just on a rock floating through space, and that's it.
Yeah.
And that's how I mainly, and then I started to have experiences where that came into question. And the first big one was psychedelics, and getting cracked open to completely different experience of things happening in what seemed like normal life, and their information and experience and things happening that just forever changes you.
Yeah.
And yeah, I know that you have spent some time in the spirit world as well. I've enjoyed what you've shared both in your social and in your newsletter about your experiences there, and I was wondering if you would like to share a bit about what you have learned and what that has done for your art practice.
Oh, how much time do we have?
Round two another time.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. So, as I mentioned, I quit my job in February 2020, second week of February, and about a week later, I found myself at an ayahuasca retreat. So I literally was on...
Was that timed? Was that planned? Or
it was planned. Really just... I planned my... It was planned and it wasn't planned. In that, I actually quit my job in November, and I knew I was going to go on this retreat. The retreat was already kind of in my awareness, and my boss asked me to stay till February. And so it was not planned in that... It was planned in that I made the decision, but it kind of worked out in such a way where I was actually supposed to originally go on the retreat in April. A spot opened up in February. I got asked to stay till basically a couple weeks before, so it just worked out that way. And as you know, I came back first week of March, and I think 6 days later, San Francisco shut down for COVID. So I ended up in this very intense spiritual, psychedelic, everything experience, and then the world shut down. And I had 2 years to think about it. But maybe the abbreviated version of the story, because I have gone back and sat in ayahuasca ceremonies since, and it has actually been a really big part of my creative journey, was I think my intention going into that retreat was not to become an artist. But now, kind of living through the past 2.5 years, it's really hard to separate out my creative journey from my work with plant medicine. In that, like, some funny things, like struggled with depression most of my 20s, and that's why I originally went on this ayahuasca retreat. I both knew I was kind of making a pivot in my life, and my intention was help me clear the smoke so I can step out into my fullest color, which was part of a Rumi poem. And my feeling behind that was really like, let's get rid of like this depression thing. There's a lot of ways it was holding me back, as you can imagine. And I came out of that retreat, and that's when I started painting. And I didn't see myself painting in like an ayahuasca ceremony. I had no literal experience where it was like, now you must paint. It was like, oh, the world shut down. I had all these paints in my apartment, and I started painting. And for the first time, I started painting abstract. And I just, as you mentioned, was trying to get into this like flow meditative state. And these abstract paintings started coming out of me, and I had never allowed myself to paint like that. So that, when I looked back on it, I was like, oh, I asked to step out into my fullest color, and then all of a sudden I was painting colorful paintings for the first time. Since then, that was 2.5 years ago. I've sat in a bunch of other plant medicine ceremonies since then. As I mentioned, I meditate every day, and actually a lot of my, I guess, spiritual practice has been entering altered states, I guess you would say, without any substance. So like through meditation, I'm studying kind of like shamanic journeying, which is somewhere between dreaming and trance states, and doesn't require any substance. It requires basically like deep meditation and sometimes like music. A lot of my creative journey has been some of the things I mentioned of like understanding that, oh, art is a unique offering I am being called to do, that like really understanding what it means to have like the gift and privilege of being able to work with your hands or being able to kind of like communicate some of these things that other people can't see. And I think maybe in summary, I saw for a long time I had guilt around pursuing art because I thought it was like a luxury that most people don't get to do.
Yeah.
And through my work with plant medicine and kind of my spiritual journey, I've seen that more, I've come to see it more as both a privilege and a responsibility, not a responsibility in kind of the heavy societal way of like you must do this, but I like almost like like an offering, like oh, this is something that I'm uniquely placed and called to do that I get to do, and there are other things that are going to unfold for me if I keep pursuing that path.
I have not sat in ayahuasca ceremony. I've been asked several times over the last 20 years, but I understood it as an undertaking. It was not like acid or mushrooms, which I had done a lot of, both of those. And for whatever reason, I just kind of knew it wasn't the time yet, but I've been being called the last year or two, and I'm looking into trying to sit with a practitioner sometime soon. And I have not done any heroic dose of mushrooms or LSD in several years, but the times that I have, it's been, just an eye-opening experience, most of which I've been making art, as a pretty big part of my life. Definitely like through my 20s, I was like doing art and stuff, but, just for fun. But I feel like it was always kind of around a significant experience with the plants that something was kind of unlocked in me. What I heard you say was, maybe it was just the freedom and the courage to try something totally new. Like you weren't painting abstract, and this all came around at just the right time, and you received that information just beforehand to then be able to have that experience alongside you when COVID hit and everyone is at home and figuring stuff out. And it makes me think, do you think we have free will?
So this is why I became a classics major, actually. I've been obsessed with this question since I was a teenager. I really like the saying, everything that happens is the only thing that could happen. We talk about kind of like the multiverse and different dimensions and all these different paths, but like this idea that actually like what's happening now is like the only thing that could happen. And there's a thread of destiny that like everything that's happening was inevitable, but you could also see it in the opposite way, which is like everything I decide is the thing that's happening. It's kind of like that paradox. So I believe in reincarnation. So I sometimes think this is a bit of an escape to the free will question, because I do think we have free will, but I think we have free will, but we're pointed at a destiny. It's almost like free will within a construct. And I think, I haven't had to answer this question explicitly in a while, but I think, in the I do prescribe, at least at this point in my life, into like the Buddhist idea of reincarnation, and that we're all pointed towards enlightenment as the final goal. And I think in that construct, that's kind of the destiny and that's the destination. But it's a matter of like, how long is it going to take us to get there? Is it like 100 lifetimes, 1,000,000 lifetimes? And that's where I think free will plays a part. But on the other hand, kind of as you mentioned, it's like, I also think we're all just versions of the universe expressing itself and kind of like playing a cosmic game. So in that way, no. I don't know if that was a cop-out, but I think maybe to summarize, yes, to one extent. Yeah. But I think we're all kind of pointed at the same thing. And I think the concept of destiny in the sense of like, oh, it's my destiny to be a famous artist, I think is like looking too small.
Yeah, it kind of, is alongside the question of what are ideas and where do they come from? Mm-hmm. Because it's been through my meditation practice and listening to some teachers, when you do truly clear your mind for that brief little bit, and then the first thought enters, you have no control. You're surprised at what that mm-hmm. thought is. There's no control where that thought comes from. And if that's the case, then we have no control. Mm-hmm. To a point, because if we're being bombarded by thoughts, what I've found great with meditation is getting better and better and catching the thoughts in real time and deciding if that thought is serving me or not, letting some go, following mm-hmm. some. That's the skill that has given me such big change in my life. But if thoughts are bombarding us and we don't have control where they come from, then the idea of free will starts to get a little curious. Yeah. But then we have the free will to decide to numb out on Netflix or get in the studio. Mm-hmm. Be productive or not. Yeah. And I think it's on a scale. I too now believe in some type of reincarnation. I was always curious about it, and just now it's just hitting me, resonating with me deeper and deeper that and being a dad now, seeing a little child, mm-hmm. an infant come in, they have personality, they come preloaded with mm-hmm. some characteristics for sure. And then, nature versus nurture, free will versus not, it's like, it's a spectrum. I think it's the gray area between the two polar extremes. Yeah. Yeah, it all circles and weaves together in with the practice of art and living life. Yeah. And I think a lot about, like, there's some control we have, right? There's some we're moving ourselves forward in some way. Even if you believe in destiny, it's like, if you're just sitting in your bed for your entire life, like, is your destiny going to knock on the door? Like, no, you kind of have to, like, take moves to do it. So, yeah, I think it's all related to control. Like, I was reflecting about this on the way up. It's like, we really control so little. And I learned when I was very young that, like, life is not a meritocracy. So it's like, if you can't control things and you don't fully deserve things, like, how do you decide to live your life? And the decision I've made for myself is like, okay, I can't guarantee opportunities are going to come my way, but I can be prepared if they do. And I can actively put myself in situations where more opportunities might. And then it's almost like increasing, like, your odds in a world where everything is left up to chance. Yeah. And I was thinking, I was like, to the extent I have, like, a life philosophy, it's something like that. Of, like, maybe I should just increase my odds to be positioned for the things I want to happen, knowing that it's still, like, a roll of a cosmic dice or something by the end of the day. That's super fascinating. If there's one text that has absolutely changed my life more than anything in my life, but in the last, like, 6 years, it's the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. This thousands of year old book of poems and philosophy is struck such a deep chord in me, and there's so many deep layers you can get into about it, but it's playful and there's lots of analogy to water. And the biggest one is that life is about going with the flow. If you're trying to control everything, which is a impossibility, which is what you're speaking to, you're setting yourself up for suffering, because you cannot control most of stuff. And so to learn to just, like, there's this concept in it called Wu Wei, which is called effortlessness. And some people take that into being like sitting on the couch and not doing anything, but I've heard someone else, a greater study or, student of the Tao Te Ching than me, but they said it's not doing nothing, it's forcelessness. When you're trying to force something, you're going upstream and you're doing a lot of effort and work, and eventually you're just going to end up at the same place that you could just let go and arrive to naturally. So there's like these analogies to the natural world, and just effortlessness,
I love that,
is so beautiful and has given me so much comfort and wisdom in today's very fast, should be pressured world. It's something I point everyone to.
I haven't read it. I'm gonna have to read it.
It's really good, and it's pretty thin. I think it's David Mitchell translation version has been told by many people as the best translation, and it's great. They're just like these little. Some of them are short, some of them are long, but there's these little poems, and there's playfulness. It's funny. It's profound, and this idea of Wu Wei, effortlessness, has been big for me, because I too have been thinking about control a lot, and it's the times that I am most stressed and anxiety ridden is when I take a step back and realize I'm trying to control a lot, and that's leading to suffering. But like you said too, positioning yourself to maybe increase your chances and in opportunity is something one can think about too.
Yeah, this fall, the word, like the mantra I had for a while was easefulness, which I feel like is related to effortlessness, which is different from passivity. And I think that is kind of what you're saying, right? It's not just being like hands off, I'm not going to do anything. It's just being a little bit more easeful in your movements and like flexible. Yeah, I think there's like very slight nuances, and I have found that's where people like to the extent people want to argue about some of this types of stuff, it's like they'll use very specific words and normally make the concept less nuanced than it actually is. That's been interesting, having to be on Instagram and talk about my art practice. It's like I'm very aware of the words I use and having to be overly nuanced in a lot of ways, because so much of social media is people getting mad.
Well, speaking of using words to describe your art, I would like to get into writing. And I've really enjoyed your newsletter, which you publish on Substack. And it's wonderful vignettes into your life and your inspiration and your process and what you're making, of course. And I'm wondering if you could share just a bit about writing alongside a visual art practice and what you've learned.
Big question. So I think I posted this the other day, but in my heart of hearts, I really feel more a writer than an artist. And similar to how I said I was originally afraid to say I was an artist, like to own my artistry, I guess you could say, I think a similar thing has happened with writing, where I feel a lot more confidence around my art or maybe a lot more comfort around sharing my art than sharing my writing. So in this, I think, preview to 2023, this was a goal of mine in 2022, but it was very much a focus in 2023, is to really lean into my writing more. and how it relates to my visual work. So I've always kept a journal. That's really, I think, the core of it. Of like, for both, because I write personal essays and I don't write fiction, I write just like from my personal experience. It's very similar to my art practice in that way, where like in a lot of ways I use writing to look for peace, to do self-inquiry, and I do the same thing with art. I'm just working with my hands. So I find them really, really similar. You've read some of kind of my personal essays, but in the ones that are a little bit, I like a lyrical style of writing, which uses a lot of words and a lot of descriptors. And it's kind of like how I'm using my hands. It's like trying to find the shapes of concepts. I think if I had a writing style, that's kind of how I think of it, of like, I'm trying to find the shapes of concepts. I'm trying to define feelings and define experiences. And there's no, even though I'm a writer, really feel like there's not a literal way to describe most things. If that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
I feel like with my writing, I'm looking at the same thing from all different angles. And that's kind of like what has defined my writing style. So, yeah, I love it. I guess, I was a liberal arts major. I studied classics and fine arts. I haven't taken an English class since high school, but I always had to write papers. So I've always been pretty comfortable with language, and I'm stepping more into it now.
Yeah.
So it's another, I think, lens almost to this same point of trying to describe something.
I've talked with a few artists and curators who work on really big projects, and I've asked them, I'm like, okay, at the end of the day, the visuals have to be great, but at that level, if you're the artist, like you're only getting that kind of project because you're already at a certain level, or a curator, like you're only working with artists at a certain level. And at the end of the day, asking them, at what level is the description and the words important? And everyone's like, that's the most important thing. That's what gets, if you're the artist, that's what gets you the project versus someone else. It's like, yes, the art's going to be great,
Yeah.
but especially for like, RFPs, requests for proposals, like lots of artists, like, a new building's coming up on campus at a university. So like, let's put out a call for art. Boom, they get swarmed with proposals. Writing has to be really good for you to be able to win that.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating because, for the visual artists, they have to be really good and have the portfolio and the everything to even position themselves there. But then to be able to use words to convey whatever it is they want to convey is a totally different art form that, sounds like it just takes time to get, or people hire other people to help them,
Yeah.
people hire grant writers to help get grants, like all kinds of stuff. And so I'm aware of this, and I think it's fascinating. But on the other side of that same coin, I also just feel like using too many words, speaking for myself, I'm finding myself less and less wanting to put out information about my art because I skew the observer's experience of it.
Yeah.
And what I'm searching for is pure experience.
Yeah.
I want someone to experience whatever I make and have it be for themselves. And if I even give a title to a piece, that can swerve and skew their experience of it. And so it's like, sometimes I'm like, yeah, words, and like, they're important and stuff. And on the other side, I'm like, but don't tell me what to like think. Cause I've gone up to like pieces of art and I'm like, oh my God. And I'm like vibing. And then I read even the title and I'm like, oh, I wonder where that came from. And then I read the description. I'm like, whoa, okay. And like, sure, it's interesting, but it changes my experience. And, there's a few artists I've heard of that do not name their pieces for that reason. Just number one, the first painting, through however many paintings they make the rest of their life. And it's just, we're at 148 this week. Let's go.
Yeah.
And so it's fascinating. I've started a true journaling practice this last year. And I'm pretty much coming up on a year. And it's really fun. I've always enjoyed writing. I too went to liberal arts school, and I was always good with writing. And so it's something I've enjoyed. And now I'm kind of getting a bit more into, a journal, which is, kind of just like morning stuff. Like, I always do like a gratitude practice, and I just want to see 3 things that I'm just like grateful to start the day with. And then some like kind of prompts, and then some creative writing stuff too. And it's really fun, and I'm really enjoying it. And so to read, other fellow creatives, and especially like visual artists who are in this world as well, is really fun and fascinating to me.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of new for me. I don't know.
There's so much you said that I want to touch on. First, I'm very aware that I can hide behind my writing, especially when I combine it with painting, right? And I think this maybe comes from having studied the liberal arts and just been like, oh, I need to write a 5-page paper, and so I'm just going to be like more words and more flowery. And, really the hardest thing to write is something very concise. So I definitely think that's a thing. I've also gotten the advice, similar to what you just said, from galleries that have told me, oh, if you are an artist that can write, you need to start a blog, and you need to be writing more consistently. And luckily, I had already had that practice, but I was really surprised to hear that. And yeah, the woman who told me this, who owns a gallery in Texas and in New York, was like, curators have to write about your work, and it's really helpful for them if you write about it first, right? Like, even if they're going to write something different, it gives them a lens into how you think about things, and that in the age of the internet, that precedes you before you might even meet in person. And a lot of artists can't write, so that if you're an artist that can write, you might as well like speak for yourself. And I found that was not what I was expecting to hear, but has been great for me, I guess. So
Yeah.
I haven't been writing that much about my practice specifically, but I would like to. And to your thing about not wanting to impact the viewer, I think about that a lot, because especially I love abstract art, and I'll sometimes not really like a painting and then read the title, and then all of a sudden I like it, or vice versa,
Yeah.
right? Like, I experience this as really calming, and the title is actually a bit melancholic, and now I feel like the painting's sad, and like I don't like it as much. But one of the things I've come out of this practice, which is why I've been thinking about it a lot, because I know it was how I sold my first few paintings. I don't know if you remember this, but I had this mini series called Behind the Painting, where I would sit in front of my painting and talk about how I was feeling and what it was like. And I did that, before I didn't know any better, that you're like not supposed to do that or whatever, and let the art speak for itself. Whatever arbitrary art world rules there are. But the first few paintings I sold, the people who bought them told me they watched the video, and it really my emotion resonated with them, and so they wanted the painting. And in that way, right, it's like I literally told them what the abstract painting was about, and they resonated with it. And I've thought a lot about that because of what you're saying, because it's like I want it to spark something in the viewer that's kind of independent to them. But I think this kind of goes back to almost like artists as interpreter of the divine. It's like we're very in touch with seeing something and feeling something, but the more I talk to collectors who are brand new to collecting art, it's like not everyone has that muscle developed. So it's actually, what I've been told by some of these people is like it is empowering for them to hear me talk about it, because all of a sudden it opened up this whole interpretation that wasn't available to them before.
Totally.
So I've actually been thinking about that a lot, because it's been over a year since I did a video like that. And I'm like, oh, people found that inspiring personally I want them to get there by themselves, but like what role should I play in kind of like bringing them along?
Yeah. Yeah. I've had work where people ask me, like, oh, what is this? Or, especially with like the line work I do, people see all kinds of stuff, like mountains, fabric, air, hair, like just all kinds of stuff. And it's just, and they're
Yeah.
like, what is it? And I'm like, it is what
You
it
tell
is.
me.
Yeah.
Yeah. What
It's
is it
like
to
I
you?
see artwork like as a mirror, and it's reflecting something within you to yourself.
Yeah.
And if I can help out in that, like you said, which I think is a really great point, if people maybe are new to the art world, curious about it, want to start getting some original pieces from some artists, to be able to give them the words to use in their understanding of it, but they also like to talk about it when they have company over
Yeah,
or
exactly.
something. It's like, oh yeah. And that's also such a beautiful thing about today's world with the internet and social media, is just being able to, get the inside view into an artist's life and what goes into their work. And that's what I get asked a lot about, and
Yeah.
from when someone reaches out to me about a commission or something, they're like, oh, I just love how you like did this, or you talked about this, and with this work, and there's all kinds of things can come from that, but it's the words we use and how we use them is powerful stuff.
Yeah. Yeah,
Words,
totally.
language shapes our reality, and that can be in written words and or verbally. Something I've been enjoying about the podcast is I'm much more easily able to articulate myself and play with ideas and stuff orally versus writing. And so
Yeah.
I've been learning a lot doing these.
Yeah, I bet.
About my friends and myself. So
I
bet. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd like to get into one other topic before we part, and that has not happened yet on this podcast, and so I've been looking forward to this. But you have done very well with some projects in the NFT space.
Ooh, yes.
And this is a big topic.
I was like, what is the topic going to be?
You have done a very wonderful job bringing together both digital and analog physical artwork in some very wonderful projects. And NFTs are new to most people.
Yeah.
A lot of artists listen to this with all our eyes have been NFTs for a couple of years. Some people hate them, some people love them, a lot in between.
I'm in between.
All right. But I was wondering if you'd like to share a bit about your NFT experience thus far.
Yeah. Ooh. So, I got into NFTs pretty early for a traditional artist. I think I minted my first NFT January 2021, maybe February 2021. And they really started to peak kind of summer 2021. So I was on the early days, but not early in the whole history of NFTs. And where to begin? So I started by minting abstract work. And at the time, I think one of the things that has defined my NFT experience is, one, really sticking to being a traditional artist, and two, really sticking to launching work in the NFT space that looks basically exactly the same or very similar to my work in the physical space. And that, I think, more for worse for most people, is pretty rare. In that, for those of us following the NFT space, there's definitely been trends. Like when I first entered the space, it was all pixelated art. And then it became these like PFPs, like Bored Apes and these cartoon characters. And I saw a lot of other artist friends kind of like chase the trends.
Yeah.
And I think how I've approached NFT, I chased the trend in that I launched them early, but I've really thought about them in relation to my bigger practice. Maybe I guess like philosophically, one of the things I think about a lot is, we're artists in now 2022. Like at every point in time, there's been some sort of technological revolution or innovation that has changed the course of art history. as simple as like at the turn of the 20th century or 19th century paint tubes, right? Like artists didn't used to have paint tubes. And once you have paint tubes, you can bring your easel out into a field. And we saw all of this work in kind of like the era of Impressionism, where people were not painting fancy portraits in a studio, they were painting what was going out on the street. And that was enabled by paint tubes. You know, at the turn of 1900s, we had photography, and that wasn't considered real art the way painting was, and now we know that's like real art. So I share those examples that was kind of going through the back of my mind of like, you know, we're kind of poo-pooing on a lot of digital art, we're like poo-pooing on the internet, some artists are, and I'm like, well, we're artists in 2022, like the defining thing of our generation or this century is probably the internet. So I think a lot about that in my traditional practice of like, how does that influence me? How does that influence like the way I do work? And that was enough to get me dabbling in NFTs, because I was like, this is very 2022 art vibes. Like I might as well see what's going on. And then I guess my approach for the past year and a half, which is kind of crazy. I've been doing NFTs for that long. I haven't launched anything since October, but has been, you know, what if NFTs are like a medium, what can I uniquely do in this medium that I can't do just on a canvas? So whether that be reach a bunch more people because it's actually prohibitively expensive to ship canvases all over the world, or like I launched a big generative art project in October, which was just, you know, I couldn't have done 3,000 unique paintings in that short of a period without kind of like the code that I used. But that has kind of been my approach, I guess, as a traditional artist. And to our conversation on words, I've been sharing a lot of my like thinking and philosophy about it on Twitter. So I know from some feedback that I've gotten is like one of the things that has made some collectors attracted to my work is just like the way that I'm thinking about things, because, you know, I'm definitely not the most popular NFT artist out there, but I have sold quite a few NFTs, and people have been really interested in just kind of like the approach. In addition to liking, I guess, the image.
Yeah, there's some quote I have tried looking up. I can't find it, but it's something along the lines of, you know, it's the duty of artists to speak to the times they're in, using the tools of the times that they're in. Something like that. And I think that was something that's been very intriguing and exciting about NFTs, is just to be able to incorporate motion and sound and reach so many. And, you know, the generative projects, you know, I think we're just at such the early days. I think the idea of NFTs and what they can be is really, really exciting. And I've loved your thoughts and sharing them online, because it's really helped me kind of navigate what all this is, and is it worth it? Is it what's going on here? I think it was you, but someone a while ago said, you know, it's like, what if this is just like another variation of the same thing? Like, for me, kind of like in murals, it's like I can make a mural and then I can take a photo of it and turn those into prints. And then an NFT could be the digital print. And so it can just be like added to the suite.
Yeah, exactly.
And if we're just here interpreting the divine, for me, there's nothing more fun than using like the tools at hand that weren't available before. I mean, right here next to us, like using large scale laser cutters and like things like that. I'm like, I love the interplay between mastercraft, hand artistry, and like digital digital anything. Like that is a drawing from my iPad, made into a vector file, given to a laser cutter, cut out, assembled by me with nails and wood and paint, and just like this jump back and forth is it's fun. But then I know a lot of artists who are like, you know, very mad or like scared or something, and you know, I think this gets into a whole bigger topic of just like mindset, which is
Yeah.
really what I try to communicate to, I've done some talks at like schools and stuff, and
Mm-hmm.
anyone who's coming up to me, like a younger artist asking me anything, if there's anything I could say that is the biggest thing you can cultivate in yourself is creating a mindset of growth and
Yes.
abundance, because if you're not in that, then you are setting yourself up for a world of lack and scarcity
Yeah.
and competition.
Yeah.
Whereas, I mean, me studying anthropology through school, I'm like, we are collaborators. Like, there's that famous question, like, is there any one person in the world that could, like, make a pencil just
Mm-hmm.
themselves,
Mm.
from felling the wood to creating the pigment for the paint to the little metal band and
Yeah.
imprinting it and the rubber and the graphite, and like, we all need each other. We're all
Mm-hmm.
completely dependent on each other. And if that's the case, then I choose to live in a world of abundance and collaboration and celebrating each other.
Yeah.
And so NFTs and like this whole new possibility, it's like, ooh, what can we do with this? Like,
Yeah.
let's
Yeah,
go.
totally.
This
And
is
it's
fun.
like, yeah, I think, the artists that I've encountered who are really mad about it, they have this air of like, it's not fair. Like, oh, I
Mm,
spent this many years becoming really good at painting, and it's like not fair that we now have digital. And it just, I feel them in some ways, but I'm also like, the world is changing. Like, right? Like, you're not operating in a static world, and like,
go with the
we
flow.
go with the flow, usefulness, right? Like accepting you can't control everything, and that things are just moving. So
Mm,
like, do you want to come along, or do you want to swim upstream, like we were saying?
yeah.
And I think NFTs, I mean, they've just brought up so many like fascinating philosophical quandaries for me, such as like, how do we consume art, right? Like, this is on here. I first consumed it via Instagram. Like, at the end of the day, I'm just seeing it as an image. So, should I, as the artist, really, how much do I want to control exactly how you see it when at the end of the day, you're just seeing an image, right?
Yeah.
Like, that was one of the things I like. I've collected NFTs. When I first started, the first NFTs I bought all had a physical component. So they sent me a print or they sent me a painting because I still really like the physical if I can have it. But I was having these conversations with NFT collectors who were just like, I don't have space in my home. I don't want to have more physical things. I like get to enjoy the image of it, and it matters to me that I like got to pay for it, and now that I like own a version of it. And I really had to like look myself in the eye and be like, who am I to like force them to consume my piece of art on canvas if they don't want it?
Yeah.
When they're really like, when someone who buys a canvas sees the image first anyway.
Yeah.
Um, it's really interesting.
That reminds me, another friend of mine said this, where she said, Strider, it's not up to us what happens to the art once we make it.
Yeah.
She said, I work with a gallery in New York, and I've met collectors that are just trying to hit the next up and coming artist
Yeah.
just to have them collected. So she makes this painting, it gets swooped up to New York and directly goes into storage.
Yeah.
And these collectors have archives of storage. That painting is not being enjoyed.
Mm-hmm.
It's not hanging in anyone's. It's, again, they're trying to, get a return on it,
Yeah.
hoping that she becomes the next big thing or whatever, and all the other artists that collector does. So again, with this idea of us as divine interpreters or something, maybe we're just supposed to make, and it's, once it's made, it's up to the collector to consume it, enjoy it, whatever, to their discretion.
Yeah, totally. Oh, I could talk about that topic forever.
Well, I do want to be mindful of our time. I would like to ask you for, again, some listeners who are maybe already in their practice or getting started in their practice, what advice would you give to yourself 10 years ago?
Okay. Like, what year is it? I would have been a couple years out of college 10 years ago. I mean, the simplest advice is keep going. I guess when I think about how my life has played out, I don't regret waiting to pursue art. Because I see, whereas at the time, I was really stressed about the steps that I was going to take to wherever I was going. I now see I have like a very unconventional background for an artist, but a lot of my success has come from my unconventional background. It's like, because I did marketing, because I went to business school, I had such a different approach to the small business that is my art practice, a much different approach than I would have had I started 10 years ago. So I think with that in mind, to anyone who's just in their practice, and we've touched about it in a few different topics like writing, I think the idea that you have to be a full-time artist and that means you're 100% doing art, I think is almost the worst approach to your career that you can have. When I think about the artists that are kind of making it and happy, they're pulling all of these other skills from quote unquote other parts of their life into their practice. And what I've learned over, especially the past couple years practicing, is like, there's no such thing as like not art and art. Like, if you're an artist, everything is part of your practice. Like, the topics you like to read about, the shows you like to watch, like your movement practice, like what you eat, all of that is feeding into your life, because I think to be an artist, you really have to fully embody it in every side. So maybe said a different way, like, stop putting my advice would be, don't put a hierarchy on your activities. Think about how all your different activities can kind of serve your art practice. Because chances are the things that you're super passionate about that aren't kind of classically art are actually the things that are giving your practice like that texture and that uniqueness that's just you. You know, right? Like, your meditation practice influences so much of what you're making. And that you wouldn't go, if you went to art school, they wouldn't be like, start a meditation practice so that you have like something to talk about. But like, that's naturally what gets pulled in. And I don't hear people really talking about that. I think it's like all of those parts that are most unique and in a lot of ways most untraditional to an artist tend to be what make artists really interesting.
Yeah, well said. What advice would yourself 10 years from now give you today?
I think it's also simple. I think it's just keep going.
All right.
It's like the moment I stop and think and get anxious is the moment I stop. Whereas like when I just keep going and it's like pulling this little cosmic thread, things keep happening. So
yeah,
keep going downstream.
Beautiful. All right. I think that is an absolutely wonderful place to cap this off. So before I let you go, Alex, I would like to acknowledge you for your presence, your beautiful visual art, your words, the community that you hold both online and in the real world. You're doing wonderful things and you're creating wonderful ripples for the rest of us. So thank you for everything that you make and what you bring for the rest of us. And thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Strider. I really appreciate that. And thank you for the invitation to talk about all of these topics.
We could do another round another day because I'm sure there's a lot more we can get into. Last thing, do you have any projects or work, anything you want to share coming up? This probably won't air for a month or so, but you know, in 2023, you got anything you're excited about that you want to share?
Mostly more of the same. I will be dedicating a lot more time to my newsletter, so the goal is for it to be weekly. So if anyone wants to check that out, it's amac.substack.com. And then more self-representation and paintings.
Sweet. And people to find you online, socials?
Yes, socials. Instagram is probably the best. I always answer my DMs there. It is at Alex Maceda Studio. So just my name, studio, and that's also my website, alexmacedastudio.com.
Cool. All right, Alex, thank you again. Everybody, thank you for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed this as much as I did, and we'll see you at the next one.
Cool.
Bye.
Thanks.
Oh boy, I hope you loved that one as much as I did. I told you, so much heart, so much enjoyment, so much purity through Alex's work. I had just an absolutely wonderful time speaking with her, and I hope you enjoyed that conversation. Please, please, please give Alex some love. If you're not already following her on socials, definitely go check her out. And I'm sure, like you could tell from our conversation and her ability to communicate about life and art, her newsletter is just one of the best things written on the internet right now. So please head to her website and sign up there. So again, more on my projects like my new art collection, as well as other upcoming works and just things happening in the studio, is my newsletter over at striderpatton.com/newsletter. Also on the daily updated my Instagram at striderpatton. All right, y'all, got another one coming up real soon. So we'll see you there. Take care.